Hello everybody and welcome to today's BA Insights session, and today we'll be talking about target operating models and target state process. And once again I'm joined by three fabulous guests who are all experts in business analysis to talk to us about that very topic. Before we get into those topics, let's however do some introductions, and if we can start with yourself please, Caroline.
Hi John, thank you for inviting me along. So Caroline Beasley, I'm a senior business analyst. I've worked as a BA for many years, nearly 2 decades actually, and I've worked in utilities and financial services. And my sort of interest in target operating models has really stemmed from my involvement in TOM and operating model work over the course of my career. There were 3 key bits of project work that I got involved in, or op model work, and each of those experiences has brought something slightly different. So it's great to be able to share some of that experience and insight. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And Sam, if I could ask the same of you please for introduction.
Yeah, thanks again, John, for the invite. So I'm Sam Merrick. I'm a contract business analyst. I've been doing business analysis and business architecture for a while. I probably need to do my maths on that one. Yeah, in a lot of the initiatives that I've done, target operating model comes up. I think earlier on in my career that was very ill-defined, and sometimes you find corners of the world where it's not so well defined. I think I've found a little bit more of an idea as to what target operating model is as I've gone throughout my career. So hopefully I can share some of that as we go.
Brilliant, thanks Sam. I'm glad that you know your topic. I know you would do anyway, so it would be useful to talk about it, that's for sure. And lastly, Dev, if I could ask you to introduce yourself, please.
Excellent. Thanks, John, for arranging this session. I'm Dev Shah from Rathbone. I've been with them as a business analysis manager now for 3 years. Many years of business analysis, one that I don't even want to share a number on because it almost makes me feel too old for what I've been doing. Yeah, in my interest for target operating models, I've created a full framework that the BAs at Rathbones utilize, and it's for those that don't know, and it's not secret information, Rathbones is going through an extremely large combination with another wealth manager of the equal size. So we've got a lot of target operating models going on at the moment. So I oversee and guide all of those being put together.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dev. Okay, brilliant. And yeah, I'm glad you didn't feel the need to go into exactly how many years you've been in business, as with Sam. You notice I haven't as well, but it's needless to say, I think we're collectively probably over 10. Anyway, well, let's leave it at that. Brilliant. All right, well, let's start with the first question, if you may, and really just to introduce really what does target operating model or target state process mean to you? And Caroline, if I could ask you that question first, please.
Yeah, of course. So for me, I think target operating models are really kind of the linchpin around the success of investment in change. So, organizations spend a fortune, a lot of money on implementing technology change, but actually what's quite often overlooked are the kind of broader implications of that change that really help the success of it. And that's really where your target operating model comes to play. It sort of says, well, this is what the future is going to look like. And actually, these are the things that we need to consider and maybe put in place to be able to support that going forwards. And so really the target operating model sets out that direction of where you're going. And really target operating models can be of all sorts of different sizes, I suppose. So, from a whole organization being going through restructuring off the back of potentially some new strategy, to actually we're introducing a new capability, which might just be a new platform, for example, but that has some impact on the people and the processes and the way people work. And so, to my mind, the operating model really is the linchpin of the success of really reaping the benefits of that investment in the change, in terms of, operating in a compliant way, about having happy employees who understand how they fit in that new world, to that rolling down to sort of customers and having efficient processes at the end of the day. So I think, it means many things to different people. for me, it's around the making that sort of very sort of tactical investment in change really land successfully in an organisation.
Excellent, thank you, Caroline. And Sam, thank you.
Yes, I think great explanation by Caroline. I think probably a few of the words that I tend to use around target operating model are horizon. Horizon is in, it's always kind of moving, right? You never actually reach it. Now you might kind of go, okay, well, I'm going to deliver this particular target operating model that's going to be, you know, on this date for this particular deliverable and scope, or it might be that, you know, that target operating model is continually evolving as the strategy evolves for an organization, and you're constantly looking 5-10 years ahead and doing it. So I've kind of been involved in both. But for me, it's I mean, some of the name of it gives it away, right? Target and model tells you that you're looking in the future. You're trying to visually represent it or represent it in some kind of way, right? But it's the operating bit that I think seems to get people. See, that's kind of a systems thing. And okay, well, yeah, to operate, we have to do something. So that implies that there's process. And I know you've kind of talked about process as part of this. And I think that's a very central concept. I'm sure we'll come on to that a bit later. But there's all the things that are around that. Well, okay, who does the process? Who supports the process if something goes wrong? Are we as an organization doing the process, or is somebody doing the process on our behalf? What are we going to use in the process? It's all that sort of thing. And so process becomes very much in the middle of the target operating model. So for me, the operational bit is very much about process. But again, going back to that system and all the things that go around it. So we don't just end up doing change in a vacuum, and we start thinking about the wider implications of it.
That's right. And I mean, I guess it would be no surprise to the three of you that we'll end up talking about process a lot as well. But certainly it's good to hear that process is very much the central theme of people and process anyway, as we start thinking about target operating models. And Dev, could I have your perspective, please?
Yeah, the problem with the word target operating model is it's a word that isn't fully understood, and it really means different things to totally different people. I think a lot of what Caroline and Sam said is absolutely bang on, but actually there are other views, and there are people that will turn up and tell you that's not what I expected in Tom, because they have very different understanding of what Tom is. So it's one of those ones that I would say is actually a word that we should use in a manner that's flexible, because a lot of the people in the business seem to think it's something else now. And I like breaking things down into the most basic component. Now, if we were to think a target operating model is a big, illustrious gap analysis between where we want to be and where we are today, that sort of helps at least business analysts to start thinking about it. Actually, everybody's done a gap analysis. We understand what that is. Well, guess what? It's exactly the same thing on a much grander scale. And then how deep you go, how wide you go is really dependent on the actual organization, and more so the actual ask about what you're trying to change. But it is about change. And one of the key fundamental parts of a target operating model is being able to bring lots of different people on board and making sure that everybody understands what that future looks like. And then naturally through the progression of the program, project, whatever it is, and the processes, and looking at the technology and the impacts, etc., that's when you're able to get into the real detail, like the word you guys have mentioned, processes and operating models. But really, for me, the number one key output out of the organization, of the TOM, is being able to make sure that people are aligned. People know what that target state is, and that everybody's pulling in that same direction. It is very, very important, because too often you'll get different people with different opinions pulling in different directions, and that project is already doomed before it's even started. And getting that agreement, really key. So what Caroline and Sam said, absolutely key components of it, but a major benefit for me is to try and get all of those people aligned and in the right direction.
Yeah, I think sort of adding to that, it means different things to different people. My first, I guess, introduction to a TOM was when I worked in a team many years ago, and said, here's a new Tom, and they showed us a new structure chart. We were going through a reorg, and that was it. It's like that was, you know, for that organization and that particular area, that's what it meant. I've also seen in another organization, it's a capability diagram, different capabilities within a function, and how they kind of essentially are grouped together, something slightly different again. So, you know, to your point about people's expectation around what they're going to see, that will vary wildly, but not always give you the depth of information that you possibly require. It'll be, you know, one is very much around the people and structure. The other one I saw was around the functions, the capability, the architecture. So, you know, it's different.
Part of the operating model can be the business model. It can be the organization model. It can be value models. It can be all sorts of different other models. But actually, collectively put together, it is the target operating model for the organization or that department, division, whatever you're working on. But it is just that literally you can have a conversation, say, here's a new Tom, and it is nothing more than a bunch of new propositions or products or services that they want to offer, or a new structure, just as Caroline saw. But it does mean different things, and hopefully all of these are tending to pull people in that same direction. Sorry, one more thing for me, the target operating model really helps focus. If it's done nicely, can really help focus people on what that scope is. And then the use of the word scope creep tends to be a little less in those projects, because again, you can just pick up this one document and say, it's not in this, so it's not getting done.
And it's useful to think about that as well, and particularly things like the gap analysis and thinking about their mentality, because it means that we don't just stop at defining the process, defining what the target capabilities might be, but actually there's a point beyond that where we have to articulate the so what, you know, what is it we actually need to do as a result of drawing these different processes or reflecting these new capabilities or coming up with a new location plan, for example. You know, that so what needs to be put down, and it needs to be prioritized, and it might need to, you know, need to be more to it, but it certainly isn't the end, just defining that process as well. And you've certainly done a great job, I should say, of answering all the points I sort of noted down before that. I thought I might add a pearl of wisdom, but you've definitely ticked all the points I would have discussed as well. But bringing together all the process, the people, the locations, the architecture, the functionality, and then going beyond, certainly is a nice way, I think, to articulate what a target operating model is. And I think from just by talking about it as well, what's clear is that, you know, when we think about the target process, the applicability of that in this context is actually, the target process is a component of what we will put together for a target operating model. But of course, you know, for different purposes, we might be asked to put together a target process outside of the act of pulling together a target operating model as well. So it's been nice to sort of, that distinction, I think, has been quite obvious from the points that the three of you have made anyway. I just wondered, just building on that question, and that is actually how you go about defining your target operating model, or indeed your target process. And I wonder if I could start with you, Sam, first on that particular question.
Yeah, sure. So I think there's three different reasons, I would say, for building a target operating model. And I'm interested here if anyone's got any more, but but I sort of see the analysis. We just talked about the scope, trying to understand what's part of that scope, what's part of that target operating model. So you might start with, you know, frameworks that look holistically at the organization, you know, about POPIT or POLDAT or POLISM, you might have heard of as well. So, you know, people, organization, process, information, technology, data, suppliers, management systems, all these different things. You can build onto these things. They're just an initial list of things that you might want to kind of go and look at. They're always connected, right? So you can start to understand, well, what's the scope of the operating model? Where are we making, well, in fact, I'm moving on to the next bit here, but where are the impacts of the change, which is the next bit. Yeah, another reason to look at is to go, okay, well, what's the impact here? And you might go, well, where's the change actually making, and what's the knock-on effect within the target operating model? So you've got analysis, impact, but then you've also got design. This is where it gets a bit sexy, isn't it? Because you start going, okay, right, well, I've got all these things in my business, and we're going to rethink about how to do it. We've maybe got a strategic goal, or we've got some design principles. Maybe you haven't, and you've got to kind of define them, which makes it even more attractive. But you know, you're able to kind of start to think about the art of the possible, or where the organization's heading. You start to play around with different concepts and different potential operating models. For me, it's there's 3 different use cases to it, but initially it's kind of almost like figuring out where the dots are, then connecting them, then understanding how they fit together.
I'd agree. Yeah, and it's good that you started with the current state process there. I'm sure you might, Sam, but at least for other BAs as well, by starting with that current state process, we can actually understand not only what needs to change, but actually the good things that are happening already that we wouldn't want to disregard, and who's involved as well, of course.
And I'd almost step it back a stage kind of prior to that, which is around what's your driver for change, right? What's the reason, what's triggering this, right? So is this driven from, you know, a regulatory challenge, something that we need to address to remain regulatory compliant? Is it we're trying to fix a business problem? Is it, you know, we've got a new strategy and we just want to do we just want to operate differently to be able to meet a different strategy. So I think really understanding what's driving that need for change is always really important. We should keep our eye on that all the way through the work that we're doing. And then that in turn sort of links in with the benefits of doing it at the end. You know, have you delivered the benefits? So, you know, that top and tail, I think, is really important. And you're absolutely right about, you know, the design bit. And for me, it's about you go through design and then you move through to implement. You start off high level, you start to build out the detail behind, you know, what that operating model means. So I've used the approach of, you know, designing a target operating model blueprint. And it's really quite high level. It's just saying these are the different aspects, the different elements that we need to consider as part of this change, because actually that's what we recognise is applicable to the kind of going back to the driver for change. And then once you've got that Tom blueprint and you've got that endorsement, you've got that support, those are the right elements, you then start to build out the detail behind it. And so that's the approach I guess I've used in sort of my more recent operating model work. But yeah, it's about, I say, don't take your eye off the prize.
It's actually what you were saying there, Caroline, was resonating with some of my most recent target operating model experiences, in that, yeah, you might commence the activity with a very specific set of business drivers in mind. But as we go through the process, or go through the act, as it were, of understanding the current state process, whilst we might start thinking about the impacts of a regulation, might be an example, or a need to change location, might be another. Yeah. As we're talking to business participants and stakeholders, understanding, you know, a bit more about the process, what's happening today, with the good things that are happening, the issues, the pain points, or indeed, you know, what I often like to do is to ask about the opportunities as well that the individuals on the ground see, because we can, if we're thinking about a target state process to meet a regulation, then why not also bake in some process optimization and benefit for the end users as well?
Yeah, that's absolutely brilliant. That's where your process, you know, your as is current state process mapping is brilliant, because it teases out from your business users all of those, like you say, pain points, the opportunities. A lot of that is sort of homegrown, isn't it, within the business?
That's right. And Dev, your perspective, please.
For us, absolutely agree. Again, this is strange because we absolutely seem to be agreeing on everything. But just in terms of the mechanism that we've got, is that we start with what we call the VISOM. So the target operating model starts with VISOM being VSOM. Vision, strategy, outcomes, and measures. And that is linking exactly back to what Caroline's saying. What is that vision? What is the reason that we are doing? So even the whole target operating model, but the whole project, the program. What's the reason for it? And then we break that down into 5, 6 high level strategies, and then multiple outcomes after that, and then the measures that we would have for being able to deliver what we would see as the acceptance criteria, if you want to use a different word, for being able to deliver those. That is something we basically stop at that point, and we'll just ask the sponsors and other senior stakeholders to sign off at that point. Because if we don't get that part right, that is the core foundation of what we need to do going forward. We may then immediately kick into doing the current operating models, looking at the what is it that's there. Again, depending on what TOM it is, we may not do a full or set of current operating model reviews. It might just be pain points if it's a smaller delivery, and then look to address those. Then that's where we then will start moving into what does that future look like, the design elements. That's where it gets interesting, with lots of debates and discussions. What's the right way? What's the wrong way? And then moving into client journeys and internal journeys as well for people within the firm. How does it change their job? What do they need to do on a day-to-day basis to actually deliver some of this? Then, as Sam alluded to earlier, is actually individual department or job role, whichever variant we're looking at each one of those in five categories, and being able to assess the impact and actually understand what we need to change for each one. And that can come in shapes of the usual people, process, tech, but we then add in a couple of extras in terms of external reporting, governance and regulation. So that then sort of gives a slightly, because we're in financial services, we tend to have a little bit of additional governance in terms of the regulators, as well as all the normal HMRC type features and functions. So that is pretty much how we go around looking and analysing it. But there's a lot of that has just touched the surface. When you pick up each one of these, it can take many days to go into the detail.
That's right.
I think one point. Sorry, John.
That's right. I was just saying, just touching on something that Sam picked up on as well, like the design principles. Sometimes they're not very clear up front. So in fact, most of the time they aren't. So we tend to determine them off the back of understanding a bit more about the issues and the drivers and the opportunities, and trying to distill those into a set of principles that are going to inform the target state. Whether it's automation, cost reduction, whatever it might be. They just help focus the mind on what we're trying to introduce into the target state, which might be many things actually.
And another thing we add with the design principles is something called operating principles. So what do we want to build in by design? So design, obviously, design principles is guiding that design process, but actually what do we want on a more perpetual basis, running through the business, like enter data once and elements like that. Because again, those things influence the design, but something that needs to be maintained and adhered to hopefully for life.
That's right.
The other thing I was going to add really around approach is around, and for me, it's very much it evolves over time, right? So you start off, say, at that high level with, say, call it a blueprint, whatever you wish to call it. And, the engagement is so important. Engagement with your sponsors, engagement with your key stakeholders as to how that evolves and moves forward. And, that all helps with your endorsement and your sponsorship with that change, that will help sort of land that successfully. So for me, it's around, you start off with a high level, you socialize it, you get feedback, you then take it to the next stage of, level of detail, and you go through that process. It's so important. For me, it's such a people-centric area of work. And that's what really helps for me, deliver the success.
Yeah. And it goes back to the point that Dev made a little while ago when we was talking about the VSOM as well. I think that's quite a good whether it's that or something similar. It's quite a good artifact to be able to go around when you're introducing yourself to stakeholders, giving them a view as to why you're approaching them, to talk about their process or their needs or their architecture, whatever it might be, that they can have that clear view of what your vision is and what your objectives are as well. But I absolutely agree, Caroline, that you know, the stakeholders are very much the glue that enables all of us to actually go through these steps that you're referring to and make them relevant and appropriate. I understand. If I could, and neatly as well, Caroline, you took us on to the topic of stakeholders and
I know, I just realised
how we engage with stakeholders in the act of defining target operating models. I promise everyone else this isn't rehearsed ahead of time. But perhaps Sam, we could ask you a similar question as to how you engage stakeholders when defining TOMs or target process.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Caroline and Dev have said. You know, very much you start higher level and then you go deeper. And I think it depends on where your stakeholders are at, not physically, you know, kind of like mentally, on what journey you go on. You might find a bit like the design principles you mentioned, you might find that the things that started you off are not the things that carry you on. You know, things can change as you kind of go. And I liken it to, you know, giving somebody directions. You know, they might be at the Shard and you tell them to go to Tower Bridge and they might know how to get from the Shard to Tower Bridge. Or it might be that they've never been to London before, they've been dropped in the Shard and they're facing the wrong direction to even have a clue where Tower Bridge is. You've got to be a bit more specific as to how to get there, right? So it's, you know, it very much depends. You've got to take people on that journey, and stakeholders is, you call them the glue, John, absolutely. You know, we can't do it without them. If you're going to do some kind of change, yeah, you can go away and you can go into your back cave and play the gadgets and come out with some analysis. But if you don't talk to anybody about it, it's not going to go anywhere. So very much we're a people profession, and we've got to kind of, you know, talk to those people in order to bring them along. And the word that Dev used earlier was alignment. So the level in which you kind of get to, you know, or take the target operating model to, and potentially in different areas of the target operating model, really is about getting that alignment and making sure that whatever the reason for making that change is, or whatever the reason for making that change becomes, is, you know, apparent and is designed throughout that operating model. So yeah, for me, I think you start very much at a high level, but the key thing around that high level has to be that, yeah, that's the holistic bit. There's got to be something there that ties all these bits together. In its simplest form, it's a concept model, right? It says, you know, you've got these processes done by these people, done by, you know, it uses this technology, yeah, and just link it. At more detail, that you might use like a Canva. You might, you know, go down a little bit more detail in different areas, and you might have a capability. You might even map those capabilities to organizational units or to technology. You know, it levels of kind of modeling that can be done. And I think what's sometimes interesting is that we call this thing target operating model, and that's the thing because it's a single picture that people see as a target operating model. But actually, it's target operating models really. You more than often you're using more than one thing really here to be able to communicate with your stakeholders and take them on that journey so that they arrive at that destination at the right time. And so for me, it's not just about kind of the level of detail, but it's having a holistic way to be able to kind of link back into that overall picture and then to take people on that journey as you go throughout it.
I think it's all about the journeys as well, Sam. It's a really nice way of thinking about some of the challenges that we have to consider as well, in that not everybody currently is taking the same route on their journey, and therefore we have to consider what their route is, what they're doing, their capabilities to get there before we start exploring some of the target state journey. Perhaps there's a single most efficient path that everyone could take in the future. But by understanding the different perspectives on it is definitely a good way then to at least get a wider view perhaps on some of the proposals you might eventually make. And probably as well, it's a nice way to sometimes identify where there might appear to be similarities in the current state, but actually perhaps there might appear to be differences. But sometimes those differences or similarities might just be the way that they're termed, and therefore perhaps we can just perceive that there might be a similarity or a difference, but by bringing the stakeholders together where perhaps they wouldn't have before, we can explore it in a bit more detail and realise, is there a true variation we need to think about in the target state? or is it me just understanding the terminology that's the issue? Makes me think as well, Sam, we should probably think about maybe pulling together like an analogy library as well for BAs. We tend to use a lot of them, and every session there's a few good ones, like the journey that comes up as well.
John, I was just going to add, in terms of the one some of the models that we're working on right now, because it's bringing two firms together, they are at a highest level doing exactly the same process for the same business. Yeah. But when you start diving in a bit deeper, it does sound like they're doing slightly different processes, but sometimes it is simply a matter of language. They just call the same thing a different thing, and yet if you just would drop it onto some sort of a process map without actually thinking about it, you'd think there were two different processes. When you open up the hood and have a look inside, they're actually doing the exact same thing.
But I think there's another thing that, there's the whole cultural aspect as well. So yes, to your point, it could be the same process in two organisations, but culturally they're quite different, and you have to take that into account as part of the, as part of moving that forward. I think for me, stakeholders is almost, we say stakeholders twofold. You've got the stakeholders that are, you've got your decision-making stakeholders, the ones that are driving this operating model, the ones that are making, ultimately endorsing it and signing it off. And then you've got your impacted stakeholders, which are normally the largest share of people in this. And, there's all sorts of, considerations. I think for me, my observation has been, as soon as you start to talk about the TOM, people immediately get, that there is prick up. They start to concerns around restructuring and reorganization and job security and all of that stuff that goes with that. There's a lot of interest in there. And I think the communication side of it is so important. And if that's the nature of the change that you're making, you need to be working with your HR partners really closely, and actually they should be driving your kind of people delivery to some extent. You've got your comms, your corporate comms people potentially that you need to pull in there, because it's such a emotive and sensitive area, and it's so easy to get it wrong. So for me, that's a really important aspect that you just need to tread quite sensitively, actually, quite a lot of the time, say, depending on the nature of the piece of work that you're working on. So it's about communication. That's what it falls down to. It's about the right level of communication at the right time. It's so hard to do well, but needs to be really, really well considered.
Caroline brings up a really solid point there, something I didn't sort of mention earlier. In our target operating model framework, we don't actually have the org model part of it in the TOM. And the reason being is that we want the TOM to be freely distributable amongst all the stakeholders. And as soon as you put the org model and any structural changes, we do comment about what the differences are in the structure. What we don't do is show the design of a new structure, if there's any possibility of overlaps or no, it's not the word, redundancy isn't the word, but any place where there's overlap, which suddenly would mean that there are more people than necessary. Obviously, then there's redeployment questions. So we leave that in a separate pot, which is outside of the target operating model, because TOM we want as a very distributable and easily communicatable document, and it should be freely available to anybody in the program, any stakeholders associated to it, and anybody around that is an interested party. As soon as you put the other thing in, it becomes difficult. But communication is absolutely critical. When people know there's a target operating model, unfortunately, it lists the kind of thought process that means somebody's losing their job, but it doesn't. Quite often, it's exactly the opposite, because we're going to be employing more people or getting new blood in and uplifting existing people to utilize their skill sets and things like that. So, but unfortunately, when we say target operating model, it does tend to bring out that fear in people.
I think so. Being BAs as well, it gives us a perfect opportunity to be spreading the right level of communication and awareness as we go, so that to give reassurance to people that particularly when we're only at the stage of perhaps understanding the current state and we don't have any particular drivers that are there to reduce cost, then very much we should be encouraging the stakeholders to be open and to share all the good things that they're doing and their real problems, and making them realise that actually this might be a really good opportunity to let the organisation know that actually there's opportunities to grow the business or to make it efficient or to give them a different, more pivotal role as well, and making it about the people. And I think to maybe the point Caroline made a bit earlier, can also sort of personalise the journey when we're communicating it up to the seniors, so they get to appreciate that it's not just the process that is the glue, but it is the people that are actually, and often it is the people and that are holding things together, I think, in the current state.
Yeah. And I think there's one sort of final aspect, I suppose, that I observed certainly on the last piece of work that I had was, I work as a consultant, so I go into organisations that from outside. And what I found when I was going through the operating model work was that we bring forward obviously design aspects or design work, and work through with the sponsor and the organisation in terms of that. But what you really have to do is also listen to, and again, it kind of touches on the cultural part, right? It's around, do you know what, this isn't really going to work in our organisation because we tend to be a bit, we tend to operate like this, or do you know what, that team doesn't have the capacity to take on that extra set of responsibilities. So you have to sort of listen to that and work with it as well, because the last thing you want to do is design an operating model or a set of procedures that you just know isn't going to run in BAU. You don't set yourself up to fail. So the listening is so important, because it's around, listening to the nuances of what will work and what won't work. And sometimes you have to, you have an idea, your sponsor doesn't agree with it, but somehow you manage to land halfway between through that sort of negotiating. It's like, yeah, but if we do it like this is the benefit, and I think it'll work because of that. And you find your middle ground one way or another. So I think it's really, the listening is so key.
It's good that you introduce a very key competence that we often bring to the fore as BAs, and maybe that's the reason, listening being that technique. And sort of maybe that's often the reason why BAs are working on target operating models, because we do tend to have good listening and communication skills and bring process skills together, and whether it's the POPIT model or others, we're able to bring together a variety of techniques to be able to apply to the specific and right situation, to not just paint the picture and that story, but extract the right information from it and to share it at the right level as well. And as Sam sort of mentioned the POPIT model earlier, and I think possibly process earlier, maybe first. Maybe if I can hand over to Sam to tell us if there's any other techniques that maybe we haven't mentioned that we might use as BA when we think about target operating models.
Sorry, John, I'm not sure I was listening there. No, I'm joking. Obviously, see what I did there. No, so yeah, I think you've obviously got the underlying skills, haven't you, around communication that we've talked about, and taking people on that journey. So there's a bit of leadership around that. And yes, we did talk about process earlier. I think I also kind of named up a few things as well within there. So for me, I've always said with target operating models, process is the kind of the key concept, just because it's the one that's the most linkable. You can always kind of link back to the process, the organisation back to the process. When you mentioned location, I think you can link that back to a process, because the process takes place in a location. So I think a lot of the stuff around process is kind of really important. But again, it kind of comes down to what level you're working at. And if you're starting at the very top, you might be just kind of a list of processes that are impacted on a canvas. It might be then at the next level down, you kind of going, well, I'm going to do a value chain map, or the next level down, I'm going to do a process model. The next level down, it's going to be, more step-by-step instructions. It depends on kind of how deep you go in. So it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Organisationally as well, we've got organisation models, and we talked about organisational structure charts, but there are alternative views of an organisation that you can kind of put in. You can think about, well, what's actually your operational organisation, and what's your supporting organisation, sort of split things differently and look at their interactions. Then you're not really necessarily talking about reporting structures, about communication structures. And that's quite important as well. So I think there's some models in that place. Capabilities for me is a really important thing, and I guess it depends on the level of capability definition within the organisation, how well you can leverage that. And sometimes that's related to whether the organisation's doing good business architecture or has capabilities as part of whatever architecture unit exists within the organisation. But those capabilities are leveraged so much in processes that being able to identify, like Dev said, you've got if you can define a particular capability and say, well, actually, this capability, if we define it as this, and we all call it this thing, and actually you're doing it here in this organization, and you're doing it here in this organization, and you're actually doing the same thing. You might just be doing different. There might be a few little tweaks. You might be using different technology, or whatever to be able to do it. Capability, I think, is a really important technique to be able to use capability analysis. Again, with capabilities, you've got different levels as well. You could be quite abstract and say, okay, we'll talk about finance management, we'll talk about risk management, or you could be a bit more refined and say, okay, we're going to talk about, well, gosh, I don't know now, customer authentication, right? Kind of, a specific kind of more actionable thing rather than more general customer management, let's say. I think there's a lot of different things to be used at different levels. I think it's a case of thinking about the structure, where to use it, but also, like we said at the start, using some of those interpersonal skills as well, to be able to take people on that journey, because a model is its communicator.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the capabilities there, Sam. So I think it's a nice way for BAs to start thinking about capabilities first before we start to go down the route of picking systems or thinking about systems. And actually, as we think about capabilities, you might find that there's the same need and the same capability across different parts of the organisation, which might therefore mean we can leverage a single solution to provide that capability. Very some number of good points there, Sam. Thank you. Dev, over to you on that one, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So capabilities is something we'll definitely be putting into our framework for target operating models. Our business analysis department is just getting kicked off. They've only been in place about 9 months now, so we're working with them to see how we bring the capabilities into the target operating model. But just as Sam said, it's not one tool. One tool doesn't fit every scenario. You need to assess what's the best outcome for your objective, which is, again, going back to something Caroline said, keeping that focus as to what it is that you need to do. Each project's going to be different. The outcomes are going to be different. What they want is different. So choose your tools wisely. But general ones that we're using, I mentioned the VisOn. We use SIPOC for the high-level processes to make sure that we're getting that because we've got looking at two companies and making sure that we're capturing the data at the same level so that we can look at processes at that level. There are then multiple different visuals, tables, charts, information, drawing in MI. So all I'm trying to say is don't limit yourself to the tools. Don't think that just because it's not written in somebody's textbook or mechanism that it shouldn't be used. It is a facilitator for you to be able to communicate the differences or the direction with which you need to go and deliver. And that should be it. It shouldn't really be it's just a toolbox and it's got a screwdriver and it's got a hammer and a set of pliers. No. Sometimes you're going to need a shovel, you're going to need an axe, you might need something else. So don't be afraid to go and use those. But typically, processes are always going to be in there in some shape or another. You're never going to get away from that. But depending, again, on the depth of where you are in that program project, use it wisely. don't get lost in too much detail, because the target operating model should be, from our perspective, a very high level representation of where you want to go, and then in that design phase, really getting into the detail, real nuts and bolts stuff then.
Yeah, there's an interesting point as well, Dev, about the different tools and picking the right one from your toolbox. And it naturally makes me think that there's also opportunity to sometimes evolve or customize or merge some of the tools. I mean, thinking of a scenario, we were sort of talking about similar a little while ago in a situation where there was multiple variations of the same process. And rather than create multiple process maps, and it'd be quite difficult to tell the similarities or the differences, created a slightly different mechanism to just show the activities, the actors and the systems involved by variation, almost or on top of each other, so that you could compare. And then by doing that, it was quite helpful for the stakeholders to see that actually they were doing fairly similar things, albeit with a slightly different name, maybe by different actors or different systems as well. And that evolution helps.
And like where I said the SIPOC, we've actually amended it to be a little bit different because it suits our needs. It's not the textbook version. And those that are very strict in their interpretation would come back and say, that's not a SIPOC. It's got an extra 2 layers in it. So
purists of the world.
Yes. Beauty of a technique that's based on an acronym. You can just add a letter and it's a different acronym, and therefore a different technique.
Yes.
Caroline,
just one thing that I think all BAs should try and be mindful of when they're looking at the target operating model is, if it is external facing, understanding the impact on those externals. So customers is an easy one, but even other third parties, and just understanding how they interact in the whole of this as well, because sometimes the TOM becomes too insulant, looking inside as opposed to making sure that we're delivering what is outside. And most companies get their money from outside, so it's kind of a good idea to be aware of that side of it. Don't just only look internally. It's both inside and out.
Absolutely. And that feels like we could use maybe a SWOT analysis for some of that as well. And sticking to the technique theme, I know, Caroline, you introduced the techniques in the first place. I think we were talking a little while ago about listening as well. I wonder, are there any other techniques that perhaps Dev or Sam haven't mentioned that you might wish to add?
Well, I don't know really. I mean, I was sort of thinking more about the toolkit piece. So you know, guys have already touched on POPIT and the Polism, which is also known as the operating model canvas for Recollect. They're all, you know, POPIT's my personal favourite because it's just so memorable. It's so easy and it's my go-to, and it helps me draft out that blueprint because I go through each of those triangles in there and go, what do I need to think about here? What are the elements that I would potentially want to build into my operating model? I actually came across a different model not that long ago called Galbraith 5-star model. I don't know if anyone's come across it, but essentially, again, it overlaps a little bit. It's got processes, structure, rewards, links to strategy, but the rewards bit is the piece that I hadn't really seen in the other models, and that's around how you motivate your people. You know, and it's got that more people, that people focus in there. So I quite like that. I thought, well, that's something I hadn't really considered before, although we're probably, without realizing, considering that within our operating model work. So, you know, it's about using those tools to help you almost act as a prompt when you do your design. And then it's those underlying soft skills, I guess, you know, around the listening, empathy, you know, engaging with people, communication, and all of that is that underlining piece that brings it all together and helps you move forward and, you know, deliver that successfully. But, you know, the toolkit's a fantastic way of starting to, you know, shape your operating model. And then there's obviously the other considerations around how you present it to your organization. So, you know, what format's going to work? Are your organization very visual? Are they actually an organization that prefer things to be a bit more structured? I've worked in, you know, quite different organizations, and what would work in one would not work in another one. And so again, kind of, I guess, working as a consultant, you you flex to the culture of that organisation and what works for them. So it's just another aspect to think about when you're obviously going through your design work and doing the implementation. It's like, what's the best way for this to be digested by this organisation? How are they, you know, going to understand it the best way? And making sure you're mindful of that aspect.
Yeah, that's it. It feels like there's lots of techniques we've spoken about and tools, and it makes me think that we could probably have a part 2 here, or or extend for another hour. We won't do either of that just yet, I should say. But I mean, for loads of really useful and interesting, very valid points. I know across all the questions we've asked as well. I think one thing that occurs to me as well that I'm not sure we mentioned is just thinking about like the business information and the information model. You know, what data or business information do we capture throughout the process, or do we need to, and how does it relate to each other, and perhaps how does that relate to other frameworks, whether they're data management frameworks or otherwise.
Yeah,
because I'm talking about it, I think I do recall, I think Sam, I think you might have mentioned it before actually in a similar way.
But yeah, maybe briefly, I think one of the things that often gets missed in the target operating model, where Caroline's kind of sort of scratched the surface of it, is culture. And I think performance can be tied in with that as well. Not every organisation is capable of, you know, hitting every single level. And so sometimes there's like a focus on one thing. You know, for example, it might be customer satisfaction, how you deal with your customers, or it might be just, you know, really effective processes. And you normally find that organisations are like, you know, different. Like John Lewis is very different to your Costco, right? In those instances. So yeah, I think understanding the organisation and what's important and overlaying performance into your operating model is also a really important thing, because it helps you make some of those hard decisions about where you focus the attention.
Yeah, and I guess tying that, you know, we've talked at the very beginning about understanding the drivers, but then realising the benefits, and part of that benefits piece is articulating what benefits you're expecting to see, or how are you going to measure your success. And yeah, absolutely, something we've sort of haven't really mentioned in too much detail, but it's really important, because, you know, you've invested all of that time and effort, and you want to, and you should measure your success and or lack of success, because you know what, it's really hard to get it all right first time. And to somebody's point earlier on, just because you've done it doesn't mean it stops. It evolves, it carries on, it lives and breathes. So, you know, the metrics kind of help guide that to a large extent.
And I think that's probably a good place for us to take a pause for today's session, as we've sort of doubled back and touched on a couple of topics or a couple of aspects that we covered right at the start as well. But hopefully you'll all agree, and those watching, there's been a really interesting conversation. I feel like we've touched on loads of aspects for target operating models, as they are quite a broad and comprehensive type of activity that we're fortunate enough to do them as BAs. But thank you, everybody, for providing your expertise and your insight. Certainly learned a lot, and picked up a few new techniques as well along the way, which I shall refer to later. But thank you, everybody, again for attending.
Yeah, thank you, John, for inviting.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thanks all.